Welcome back to Follow the Rabbit, where we explore emerging trends and cultural phenomena to help you update your mental models of how the world is changing. As we mentioned in the last episode, we have some special episodes this December. Christmas special. Throughout the season, we've been investigating health as luxury and previously explored how third places are evolving. And today, we're bringing these threads together as we look at how climate change and particularly extreme heat might reshape our cities and the spaces where we gather. We're joined by Juli Sikorska, a designer and strategist who translates the uncertainty of the climate crisis into tangible experiences. Throughout her work with the Urban Heat Studio, she runs the Heat Resilient Cities Conference and helps organizations imagine and prepare for much hotter cities. She designs participatory interventions that explore how the climate crisis might dramatically change the way we live, work, and play. We'll explore how extreme heat is already changing our cities. It's not the future, people. What new kinds of spaces might emerge as we adapt, and what this means for health, community, and social equity. Juli, welcome to Follow the Rabbit.
Thanks. Very nice to be here.
So, could you tell us about how you came to focus on heat resilience and climate adaptation in cities? What drew you to this specific area of climate change?
Yeah, sure. I have been involved in sustainability and social innovation work for a while, working as a design and innovation consultant. And I always had the feeling that there's a lot of interest, but the work kind of always stops or falls short at the point when something else important comes up. So say the budget or time is tight, and then all of a sudden, all of those great intentions of, yes, let's include that as well, kind of fall short. And I think that it has a lot to do with the kind of lack of a tangible understanding being in a European city, what it means already to live with the climate crisis. And I think that we have a lot of those intellectual analysis. We've read a lot, we've intellectualized a lot, but I think that it makes really big difference how we perceive things, how we go about things when we have lived personal experiences. And so something that I was personally very interested in was exploring what would it actually mean to experience a 1.5 degrees hotter world or an even hotter world in places where I was at the time. So being Munich, Berlin, European cities. And by the way, this year we have just most likely crossed the 1.5 threshold. So that's already really here. And so this is what it means to live in a hotter world already. But that was really my starting point a couple of years ago. I really wanted to understand for myself and started looking at extreme heat because that's the most tangible impact of the climate crisis that we experience in European cities, among many other things. But that's just the most visible, most embodied one.
And it seems to really affect everyone, or is that different? Or?
It affects everyone, but in different ways. We hear the extreme heat from the global south, where we would see images of people sleeping in the shade, people who are in hospitals, are in makeshift spaces to take care of people during the heat. People die, and that is a very, very serious actual, not just threat, but what is happening already. And then here in Europe, even being in the part of the world that still considers itself very protected a lot of times. And I want to say considers itself with quotation marks. But even here we have a lot of differences, say across Europe, where the South in Greece, Southern Italy, Spain already have called out climate emergencies, have asked for extra funds to rebuild from the climate crisis, versus maybe Central and Northern European cities that may be doing better now, but also are actually much, much poorly prepared for extreme heat as it will be getting stronger. And then you can also look within cities and individual communities where you have a lot of differences based on a lot of times people's socioeconomic status, where they live, their communities, and their experience of the climate crisis as well.
When you say poorly prepared, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, so this is actually so interesting. The South, say Southern Spain, Southern Italy, Greece, a lot of cities were built in a way to deal with extreme heat already. So the streets are a lot more narrow. You will not have that much direct sun coming in. Say you go to Naples, And you can imagine walking through those very narrow streets, a lot of stone that also helps keep the city cool. There are actually two things that warm a city up. One is urban heat islands. So how a city gathers the sun from, or energy from the sun, from traffic, from people, from energy production, from cooling data centers, whatever it is. And then the other is the extreme heat that comes from the climate crisis and just prolonged, more intense periods of longer heat. And so a place like Naples would already have a lot more protection from direct sun coming into a city, where cities like Berlin, if you imagine Hermannstraße, the street is so wide. There's so much sun that can come in, that needs to come in at time like this when it's December and it's gray and we need the sun. But in the summer, it's just really not good. And so as we experience cities getting hotter over time, we can expect that Southern Europe is better prepared on a urban planning scale to deal with heat than, say, Central and Northern European cities.
Yeah, I've been a couple of years ago in Puglia, and there's a lot of those cities are built really around heat. It seems to me that there are a lot of also specific building constructions, ways of dealing with the heat already in place. I imagine a solution to Karl Marx Allee, that there is basically a new row of buildings built on top of the street. And
I mean, ideally more trees, more green coverage. You want to create more green and blue spaces, so more little parks that cool down, more water that really helps create like a little microclimate in the city. And I do want to say that urban planning is something that is receiving a lot of attention right now. This is something that, say, we have a global chief heat officer from the UN. We have local chief heat officers in a couple of cities worldwide. And a lot of the work that gets a lot of attention right now is focusing on urban structures, urban infrastructure. And that is one part of the deal. So how to rebuild a city, how to create preparedness services, say people who are able to respond during extreme heat, but also all of those changes to our social, political, economic structures. They're so relevant to not just mitigate more change, more extreme heat, but also really to adapt and transform out of the ways that are causing extreme heat and this like social injustice.
It's interesting. When we first talked about this, so we came from thinking about third spaces, gathering places in society that brings people together. That has changed after the pandemic. It has a sort of re-emergence. And we asked ourselves, what is the future of these third places? How might they change? How might they transform? And that connected us to your work. And how might climate change and extreme heat change? What is the idea of a third place in the future? And then when we talked about it, I suggested, we could like just speculate where this might go. And you said, no, this is happening already. Yeah. And you already hinted at a couple of things, but what did you refer to when you says, this is happening already? We see the signals right now.
Yeah. So I think something that I found very interesting in this is that when at Urban Heat Studio, we started first thinking about how we might deal with extreme heat, we started thinking about this, speculating and like, what if we had a group of traveling heat workers? So like imagine first aid responders or like the Red Cross, but people who are trained to deal with extreme heat, with drought, with wildfire, with health for humans, nature for ecosystems, etc. An invention in a way, or this kind of like speculation, was thinking about cooling centers. So places that help people keep cool, because we can expect that especially people who are older, people who have any kind of pre-existing health conditions, people who have kids under the age of 4 or 5, people who may be living in old buildings, Altbau apartments, or basically anybody on the top floor that receives just a lot of additional heat. We already know that that really damages sleep, and sleep is when the body recovers at night. So we really need cooler temperatures. And so this is where it becomes extremely relevant to have cool spaces where people get to recover and rest. And so we were imagining those cooling centers that people could go to and say, spend the night, spend a couple of days during the day to cool down, or even maybe a prolonged time over the summer. And where it already is reality is that right after we thought about this is when the heat wave in the Pacific Northwest happened in North America. So where Canada and the north part of Western US had this heat dome where people would be forced to go to local schools and sleep in the like gymnasium or whatever they had there. And so those kind of makeshift spaces also already exist to help have a cool space. But actually the interesting is that they have also existed for a long time, especially in the US. There are, say, community centers that offer that kind of cool down space, but research shows that they're not really being used. And there's probably a lot more nuance to it. But say there is people who already would go to, say, a community center because they take a dance class there. And so they would already go and be there, but not for the reason of I'm going to go there to cool down, but because I have something else to do there. But then those spaces that kind of just pop up out of nowhere, they're not really finding a lot of traction, or people may not really notice the necessity of going to a space like that. So there's a lot going on of like, how do we reach people? How do we create awareness? Why don't people go? That I think still needs to be researched and really understood.
But to kind of go a little bit in a specific in that sense that, let's say it's summer again and it's really hot and I actually have access to those heats, like cooling centers, really not heat centers. Because you referred to sleep, and I agree, like we did an episode 2 episodes ago on sleep being a new luxury. And I imagine that a family of 4 going to one of the centers, sleeping there, will not necessarily result in any better sleep because it's shaped, like, I mean, for different reasons.
Yeah.
I mean, we prefer to sleep in our own bed. And I'm like, while you were talking, I was thinking, there is a law in Germany, or at least, I don't know, it's Germany, Berlin, that you have to have a stove in an apartment. And I started thinking, well, there's this company of doing those cooling mattresses.
Right.
And we can mandate into law that anyone who lives on the top floor gets one of these, because
8 sleep cooling pads.
Like 8 sleep cooling pads, just because, I mean, we need more living space. We can't abandon the top floor.
Right.
So
yeah. So that is, I think, also really interesting because there's 2 things here. One is at the time of the heat wave, I was talking to someone who was in Seattle at the time. And so they, at the time, would just gather with the neighbors and kind of pick one apartment where they ran the AC really, really strong, because it also it takes so much extra energy to run an AC to cool it down to a certain level. So they would basically all gather in one place that they then cool down rather than cooling many individual apartments, and also hang out and have some social time and bond and get to know the neighbors the way that some people met their neighbors during the COVID pandemic here. So that's one thing. The other is that it's kind of, I think, similar to what you mentioned earlier about the sleep gadgets, that like that is one fun thing that we can like do to track our sleep. But in the end, it kind of comes down to what kind of neighborhood do I live in and how much is my neighborhood taken care of and invested in, and how many resources does it have? Because sure, you could have all the fun gadgets like a cooling mattress. And I mean, I'm curious to hear how much it actually cools it down, like how much degrees literally, because I think that the kind of threshold for a somewhat healthy regenerative sleep is 20 degrees at night, which we go past in Berlin a couple of times a year already. And then, you can have your fan, you can maybe even have an AC. Like our apartments in Germany are not built to have air conditioning. And it just creates so much excess energy that I think we really have to think well where that makes sense. And I think it really comes down to insulating apartments better. The thing that we need to do for winter also helps in the summer, creating a better protection from both cold and heat. It really has to do with building parks nearby, because even a small park of, really just a little green space, which a bunch of greenery that also goes up a little bit, cools down a neighborhood. There was a study in Munich that showed how in between walking 10 minutes from one particularly hot place to another, you could have a temperature difference of 6 degrees. And that is massive when you imagine, is it 30 or 36 in the sun? So I think that those are the differences that really make a difference. And also from a more justice perspective, social justice, climate justice, that would also make more sense investing in creating cooler neighborhoods.
So I'm kind of curious still about the third places in the sense that I've seen also a story a few years ago already where people in Arizona started doing all kinds of communal and exercise things at night because Arizona is just too hot to do anything during the day, really. And I mean, that's a really interesting signal, right? People start doing exercise, like clubs started forming and getting together. But it does create, obviously, also kind of a feedback loop where, well, if you're exercising at 11 p.m., because that's the only time that you can do it, that either robs you some sleep or you have to have a different time schedule during the day.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, like, how do you see socializing? Because third places are really about socializing, people craving a community of either common interest or anything that helps them also not feel lonely, which is another aspect of that costs us a lot of health. And
So
I'm
much
wondering,
in
like,
heat as well, and heat safety.
yeah. So I'm wondering if you have any other examples, maybe, where how social behavior and coming together changes.
Yeah, so again, here I don't really have to look into any future speculations. There is so much out there, especially, places in the global south or even southern US that, again, like are not, I wouldn't say like one-to-one, this is what we need to prepare for, say in Germany, but this plus imagine all of the other shits that might happen. But say when I was 15, I lived in Texas for a year. I went to high school there. And so my host father would go for really long runs, and he would wake up at 5 a.m. in the morning to go on his like 5 to, I don't know, maybe sometimes even 10 minute run, because that was the time before it got to 40 degrees in 2005, 6, whatever. And so, right. And I think it's just something that was very, very normal there. Like all the people would just go for a run at the time because that's, or after work. So, or like after 6, 7, maybe 8 p.m. when it cooled down. And I don't think, I mean, this specifically, I don't think that people would wait until 11 because then it was even cooler. I think, or just this feeling of, start school down. That already really helps a lot. So that's one thing. Another is that places that have more extreme heat kind of have created social routines around that. So like in Spain, you would have a siesta, and that's just a normal thing. In Germany, it still probably would be so unimaginable. Like, how could you sleep during the day? You know, if you work in tech, it's a helpful nap. If you work in
Johannes
lower
can tell
wages,
you stories about it.
but it's also how we perceive something, right? Like if you work in tech, like SoundCloud used to have napping rooms for the people in Berlin. But if you work in lower wages, it's being lazy if you sleep during the day, right? So there's also this double standard of how we deal with that and who's more exposed to it. And I mean, I could speak more of which job groups are more exposed to extreme heat. Hint, everybody working outside, mostly lower labor. But even here we have, say, doctors who would already, as a prevention mechanism for extreme heat, they would already in Germany try to have visiting time. So when people come to see the doctor early in the morning and late at night, and they basically recommend that especially older people do not come during the day, during the midday heat.
So what fascinates me is if we, again, look at it from a third place perspective is, so we came from an understanding of the third place as the neighborhood bar where you would go after work or a cafe. And now it's evolved into most newer third spaces are more exclusive. So the first understanding was it's a very low barrier place where everybody can go, and actually a lot of society would come together and just, you could just be there. You could be on your own, or you could talk to people and have conversations, exchange. And it seems the reemergence after the pandemic is more focused on not just membership clubs, but more like I have clear ideas. I'm meeting with people with the same interest. There might be a higher barrier to entry by just like entry fees or just social status. And what I'm thinking about is how that again changes when cooling centers, or as what you also described, climate safe havens in cities, becoming this, or will be new third spaces that you're kind of forced to go to be secure and to cool down. And I'm thinking about, or trying to imagine, because the interesting part is you go there to be safe from the outside. So you spend some time there, but you probably are not just going to sit in the corner. Yeah, I mean, right now, I can actually quite imagine everybody just sitting in the corner on their phones and scrolling. Yeah. But I think there's new opportunities emerging. Like, you bring people together. What can we do with that? Do we build restaurants, cafes in there?
Yeah.
Is it a new like mixture of co-working plus gym plus whatever, or actually new forms of cultural or community gathering emerged out of that? I think there's an interesting way to look into that.
A quote comes to mind that we use a couple of times: the obvious opportunity is to start a new religion.
I mean, all of the things that you're mentioning are so relevant. So I think, co-working spaces already are most of the time cool collective spaces. Gyms, that's literally where it cools down. Supermarkets, especially for older people, supermarkets are literally the place where you can cool down, where you spend a considerable amount of time if you want to during the day, during the day heat. There is this cool map, the Coole Karte, made by Technologiestiftung in Berlin, where they literally have mapped all of the places that have, say, a temperature below, 25. And Lidl apparently has the coolest temperatures in their stores. So that's a great place. But who goes to who goes to a co-working space? Who goes to a library? Who goes to a gym? But any kind of those like already existing spaces that gather people in a way for a reason, I think that those are really good third spaces, or I don't know if you would call a supermarket a third space. I think some people might socialize the way that we would socialize in front of a space.
But it might change to that. I mean, and that's the interesting part that I hear from you is, so in my mind, I hear cooling centers or climate safe havens, and I think new places, or we have to build them. But the first part, obviously, is to say, dear supermarkets, you have a responsibility in our cities. You have to create spaces in the supermarket because you already have the infrastructure and it's good for your marketing or whatever.
I have a personal, because I was interviewed by a company that was doing explorations with retail space, and they were actually specifically talking about, well, how do we make, because we're interested in supermarkets becoming third place, and I was like, oh, that's a stupid idea. And I have to walk that back because it's obviously a really interesting point of view. And I think, that's a really interesting.
And we already have supermarkets that would also open like a cafe or a restaurant, and then it would also provide Wi-Fi. And then that is really nice, because I think that is also a really helpful place for, now maybe this sounds a little bit too obvious, but I think elderly people, like I'm just thinking about my own grandma who during the pandemic going to the supermarket was her social outing of the day, and the time that she was allowed to go with the other elderly people where there are no young people. And so I'm just thinking of, imagine going to a supermarket that would also have some place to sit, cheaper coffee where you're not paying, like the Starbucks, I thought original third space where a coffee is €6-7 versus something like a coffee for €2 that you can have with your friends or other people who are in a similar situation like you. And so I find that really interesting. I was just thinking how I think, retail has been for a long time thinking about how to create more experience spaces, showrooms, whatnot, how banks have changed their entire setup inside from, you come here to me to come to my booth and do your whatever you need to do, to here's couches and would you like a coffee or whatnot. I'm not sure if that's still a thing. I don't really have a physical, the banks disappeared, right? We don't have
exactly. I think they just they don't,
banks are just an app.
No customer facing things.
Right.
It's just,
But so see, I think that's really interesting because it also has a lot to do with who creates a third space and what's the customer base. Is it a premium product that I'm paying for because I'm either young and hip and cool, or I have a lot of money to invest in something, or do you know, I can create community spaces that are I want to say available to everyone, and it's also not everyone, but I think there's such a value in gathering with intention. I crave gatherings with intention, meeting people who are interested in similar things like me. And honestly, my favorite spaces are those where either it's a coffee shop that I know really well and I know the people there, but also those places like purposefully community building initiatives. In Recurve, for example, there's a SPORE initiative, I don't know if you know it, that actually is, they're trying to cultivate the space of like the neighborhood should come in and gather here. And I think that those spaces are so incredibly important because they don't require you to buy something. And because you mentioned religion, churches have, as much as I'm not a fan of the institution, but there
What
is
do you
such a
mean?
value. Well, that's a different podcast, isn't it?
How much time do we have?
How much time do we have? I think there is such an incredible opportunity to use churches that were literally built to be cooler. Also, some of them. There's a fun story to that too. But churches already have community gathering spaces that can be used in so many different purposes. And so again, just to here name an example, Startbahn, again in Neukölln, is an event place that it used to be a church. It's still a church. They still have church services, but they also open up the space for protection from the cold in the winter, especially for unhoused people. So say if it's freezing outside, then you can sleep in there and it's warm. You go there in the summer when it's already hot. They already create a cool space there. But also everyone's invited. There is Wi-Fi, so you can literally, what you were just saying, Johannes, like sit on your phone and scroll. And it's kind of still like a pleasant space to go to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think there's something about like ambient awareness. I think there's a huge difference in scrolling my phone on my own sofa or scrolling in the context where others are around me. Not to go too deep into that, but I think this general idea of more being in a space with people and by just having interactions is always a good part.
But maybe, so I'm kind of curious about this part because I just recently actually only watched the Blue Zones documentary, and there is this specific example that he brings about this town in California where the town is very much kind of like built around this church, Adventist church. I'm not quite sure. And there are two components to that were very interesting in that sense, that the Adventists had already kind of early on a deeper understanding of health. And so they talked a lot earlier about that aspect. And because of that, basically, it has a huge community in that town and also really great medical facility. And that's why people are pretty old there. But an aspect that made me think about this religion part now, as well as that we always talk about all these things that we could be doing, but a lot of people are, even if they're aware of the issues and even if they agree with the issues, it's very hard to change individuals' behavior on your own. And I think the documentary touched upon is it's far easier to change behavior and sustain that changed behavior if you're not doing it on your own. So if you have people around you who are behaving in a similar way, it is easier to stay vegan because there are a lot less ways of you to call back on bad behavior or previous behavior. And so I'm wondering, I think the reason why I'm kind of curious about this is I do not necessarily like organized religion or monotheistic religions myself. But there seems to be a certain social truth about the fact that we need to supersede our own individualistic desires to do the right thing.
Yeah, I can only agree. And I think one thing that religions used to do really well, but I think it's not limited to religion, is building community. Yeah. Because in Germany, we are a very individualistic culture.
It doesn't show aesthetically.
But isn't that why people, build those running clubs and whatever that is? Because community is nice. We thrive in community. And I think that, there's just a lot of potential to really reach not just individuals, but communities, because our social circle and our personal experiences are the best indicator of our attitudes, our political views as well.
I find it really interesting where this conversation has taken us. Because what you described is there are huge challenges ahead of us from climate change, from extreme heat, that especially cities are challenged. There's already a lot of knowledge and best practices, I'd say, outside of Europe or Northern Europe and Germany, easily, in other countries who have experiences with that. But so there's enormous challenge. And if we continue the way we are as a society handling this right now, it's going to be a huge problem. And one part is that, yeah, it's a very individualistic society. Another part is this social injustice and status differences. Wealthy people going to be able to afford much more heat-resilient measures than people who can't afford it. And if we don't do something about that, much more people will die than already do. And that's the thing that I'm hearing here, is there's a huge opportunity in there. There's a huge opportunity for society and citizens to come back together more, to use this opportunity to form more community, to gather in spaces, because climate change and extreme weather events and heat are a much bigger problem if you're facing them alone or individualistically, as if you actually find solutions together. I think this idea or this example you gave of people in houses saying, oh, tonight we all go to this flat and use this AC, and tomorrow we're going to the other one to just share these resources. And for me, it's always interesting. We say, okay, this is an idea. We just do this so we can save energy. But then you're sitting there. And then what happens? You're not just sitting there and waiting. You talk to each other and you cope together and you just are together. And that already will change things. And I think there's so much opportunity in there. So what would be some recommendations if people listening to this and say, oh, this sounds really interesting, and this might be people
Is this our Ezra Klein moment to recommend us your 3 books?
Yeah, I think 3 books are always very specific to those who read books. And for me, it's more on a general idea. There are people here who maybe do work with brands. There might be people listening who are more in policy making or city planners. What are some things you would point people to or say, think about this, or this might be a good first step that that makes sense for you?
Yeah, I'm not sure how much I have to share for people working with brands, because I think that is part
like
of
supermarkets. You should think about opening your cafes.
I'm writing up a concept to Lidl to start a new.
There you go.
To start a new Lidl religion.
I mean, what I would really wish to see is more spaces where you're not required to purchase something to be able to exist in a space. I think there's a lot of different ways how we can be contributing, say through shared gardening, whatever it is. And those are already very common concepts. But I would really wish to have more community spaces that really form purposefully, gather people intentionally based on interest, need, whatever that is. I like books, or maybe I have a kid, or I have a dog, or I have this super special interest, something like that. And gathering people there and creating connections between people. And I think it can be public or semi-public spaces, but it can also just be people creating stronger networks among themselves and gathering at home in people's places. As simple as this sounds, I think that such stronger community networks are really the best. Yeah, the thing that I'd most wish for.
I know, Johannes, we're saying we're going, but it would have so for me, the question is...
That's why it's called Follow the Rabbit.
It's called, it is very much. So we're not talking about the elephant in the room in the sense that it's economics, and especially economics in terms of real estate, right? If real estate, one of the things that we observed also in the third place, seriously with it, is that the reason why third places, the new ones, are commercialized is because real estate is just hugely expensive. And so people can't afford to create spaces that have a low barrier to entry, because you have to instantly monetize them in a way.
But
And
that's also not a given, right?
no,
There were also choices, past policy choices. Like right now I'm in Vienna and the real estate situation here is wildly different.
100%. Like Vienna is a really great example of how to regulate that in a way that is, well, didn't break the bank and also created lots of different things that are much more favorable. That being said, and I don't want to nail you on a binary thing because we don't like binary here anyway, but a little bit like as a provocation, do you think it's likelier that we will solve this problem inside of cities? Or is it likelier that more people will move outside of cities because cities will become a little bit too unbearable for too many people?
I'm very biased here because I love cities. So I will
Right.
always tend to respond to that. And we all live in Berlin, which is the biggest city, right, in Germany.
For now.
I do think that rural areas would have a lot of potential, but they're not getting a lot of attention. So even say like public transit reaching rural areas, if you only have 3 trains during the day, that's not a viable option to a well-connected city. So I do think that cities are sadly also because of brands are just receiving a lot more spaces and attention to deal with extreme heat and other extreme weather. And I also think that the way that we imagine cities now might be just radically different as we experience more flash floods, more droughts, just really, I think, wildly different conditions.
Okay. Well, yeah. I mean,
I just love just to like also connect it back to the recommendation. It's all about community building. I find it's so fascinating to me because the best answer to the challenge of climate change is, to a certain degree, community building. It is the foundation for that. The funny thing is, as we've this season talked about health and health as a luxury, community building is also the best strategy for longevity in health, because
Really,
science clearly shows that your social connections are the
through social
most
capital.
determined factor about how healthy you are and how long you live. And so we have all these different challenges, but the solutions are very similar and also going into this direction. And so I think that's a good place to bring it to an end. Is there anything else that you would like to add or a thought that comes to mind?
I mean, just the thing that I was just thinking about as you were summing it up is that, in a way, my personal goal is to now build my network of friends and people close to me so that when I'm 80, I can be, I don't know, like drinking coffee or wine with them and do my painting sessions and read books together and have all of those clubs and have dogs and whatnot. And I think that that's literally like now the best strategy for preparing for whatever might come.
That's it. Beautiful. Thank you so much for joining
amen
us.
to that, I guess.
Yeah, thank you for having me. That was really fun.
Very good. So we have the links to Juli's work in the show notes. Please check it out. It's highly worthy of your time. And thanks for coming along. We'll see all of you in the next one.
A good one. Bye.
Bye.